We're going to do some football with Aqib Talib here in a moment, as we said in the intro, but I want to start with a big story with the NBA, and that is the Ben Simmons saga, as we now have official word from Woj, who reported yesterday and in the piece that Ben Simmons is not showing up to camp. He's going to hold out, and it was even some strong language in there where he's never going to wear that NBA uniform again, meaning the Sixers. So, all right, where are we at? Now, we had mentioned this as a possibility on the pod. I remember first hearing about it earlier last month. And then Bill and I did kind of a Ben Simmons thing together on this podcast. We're like, all right, is this really going to happen? After the Hawks series, it was bad. And I know that this isn't exactly breaking news to anybody here. For the longest time, even though the Sixers were a good team, and who knows what would have happened with that team that lost to Toronto a couple of years ago, I still don't think it was going to win a championship against a healthy Golden State, but Golden State ended up not being healthy. I mean, there's a bunch of moving parts here. You can't predict a future that didn't happen. But even though they were winning games, I just never understood how anybody could watch them play together and think that it worked. And the Hawks series was the culmination of all of those thoughts. If your analysis is, it's going to work because it's my favorite team and I hope it works, whether you cover the team or just root for the team, that's never going to be something where I'd be like, oh, cool, tell me more about your breakdown. I also have always pointed this out. I always felt like there was this hinky supportive mafia that refused to believe that it didn't work basketball-wise because there was a bunch of numbers. Even Daryl Morey, who tweeted out, hey, look at the best five-man groups, plus, minus, and all this stuff. And it's like, look, what do we keep telling you over and over again? I learn about you as a basketball player in the last 4 minutes of a playoff game when all the starters are in and the shit matters. What do you run? What works? What looks good? What looks bad? And honestly, all of the Simmons and Embiid stuff, even though they had huge leads in those games and blew that series, all of it looked bad. And the ultimate part was Simmons, passing up an open dunk. And then Doc Rivers is asked afterwards, hey, is Ben Simmons a championship caliber point guard? And Doc says, I don't know, because Doc is very honest, and that rubs people the wrong way. And then you had the Embiid reaction after all that, right? So there are some corners, I think on the Philadelphia side, not all, that are almost dismissive about this, and I think this has been met with the same kind of reaction, some media circles as well. It's like, okay, you want to hold out, but you're Ben Simmons. Like, okay, you're unhappy. Things didn't work out. And a lot of times, too, there's not much accountability. It's always hard for all of us to be like, yep, this is totally my fault. None of us like doing that. Every now and then, I think you have to do it. And in this case, it feels like Ben Simmons is not going to do any of those things. There's just parts of his game he never got better at. And he's a weird fit, especially a weird fit with one of the 1990s style players in Joel Embiid, right? We saw all of these things happen. Now, I don't know how dismissive you can be. You can be like, oh, well, all right, Ben, you don't want to show up. There's also some pay structure stuff that we're learning about here that's pretty interesting. And that Simmons was paid 25% of his $33 million on August 1st, and then gets another 25% October 1st. So maybe that's why he's more inclined to not want to show up. I think there's also some ego versus team in this, where it's like, okay, you want to hold out? All right, well, we're not going to do you any favors here. We're not just going to give you away. We're not going to send you to the only teams that you want to go to, which I want to get to a little bit later here. But ultimately, you got to kind of wipe out the ego part of this and do what's best for the team. And Simmons not playing and not getting any assets back for him long term, even though I think the Sixers are still going to win a bunch of games without him in the regular season, it's still an asset that you can use to improve the rest of your team, and you're going to have to get over it at some point. But I don't know if it's going to be ownership. I don't know if it'll be front office. I don't know if it'll be the coaching staff. But I think there's some part of that where it's dismissive to this point because the deadline is not here yet. And I don't even know what the deadline is. Now, let's talk about the public part of this. From the Ben Simmons side, there's been talk that the Sixers could have done more. They could have been more supportive. Sure, Doc could have not said that. All of it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. You're going to sell your story. You're going to sell your side. It's his, if you're part of the Ben Simmons team, you're looking out for your guy. All right. I totally get that part of it. On the other side, if you're the Sixers and you start throwing out some of these trade demands, again, the Golden State one that leaked out that is fairly accurate, Wiggins, Wiseman, Moody, Kuminga, and 2 first. It's an absurd price. Golden State doesn't need to pay that kind of deal because it's like, wait a minute, we still have a pretty good team. We don't need to gut all of our young assets here to try to solve your problem. You could also make an argument to be like, how does all of that fit for Philadelphia if they're a team that's thinking about winning the East or a championship right now with however they look post Ben Simmons, right? So the public part of it, it's interesting. We'll all talk about it, but whether it's public pricing, or whether it's a public statement about how Simmons is undervalued and all these different things, like, it doesn't really matter. So now it comes down to what the value is. And you always kind of look at some of the leak stuff. You go, all right, well, who leaked the Golden State thing? Did Golden State leak that offer just because they were talking to somebody, it was interesting, or did they do it strategically because they want people to know that the Sixers are delusional? Or did Philadelphia leak that price because they wanted to set the market for a player? And you're like, just so anybody knows, if you're calling us, like, this is the kind of stuff that we're asking for. I'm reading the Hagler-Hearns book right now by Don Stradley, who came out last week, and they were trying to figure out, Bob Arum and all these promoters, what they were going to get Hagler for that fight. And they were like, we're going to get $8 million. And nobody believed that at the time, all right, because it was an absurd number. And then there was a line in there that was like, look, just throw out huge numbers publicly and the rest will take care of itself. That has been the Scott Boras playbook forever. Hey, so-and-so might be a $500 million player. And then you get the player for $3 million. You're like, man, we saved $200 million. That is right out of the playbook of so many of these people. And that's also what happens in the NBA trade market. When we start to figure out what the value is for him, we can't really look at some of the leak stuff. We can only look at like what the circumstances are. Now, I am always on an island on this one. And so I know a lot of people disagree, but I just don't buy into all the bullshit and all the noise. Like if Doc had been nicer, like when people say like, well, Doc didn't say he was an NBA championship caliber point guard. So, you got to wonder what his value is around the league. We know this about players. There's 30 different front offices. There's a lot of different opinions. Despite how bad it is for Simmons right now, you have to imagine there's at least 5, maybe 10 teams that are like, look, we'd love to have this guy. We still completely believe in him and his unique talents. And if we get him in here, we can fix all of this stuff. Those teams exist. I don't know what the list is. But I'll hear like every day the value goes down the closer we get to this. I don't believe in any of that stuff. I just don't. I'll use a baseball analogy. Whenever there's a big-time player that has a year left on his contract that's with the team, or maybe it doesn't look like he's coming back and that team's headed in the wrong direction, I'll always hear baseball writers say, you got to trade him now because the value will go down all the time. You don't know that. You can't predict markets. You don't know if in the baseball sense here, if you have a player, you don't like any of the offers, you go into the season, by the trade deadline, you could have 3 or 4 teams that are in the mix playoff-wise or reaching expectations they haven't hit for years, and they're all impatient. Now they're all bidding against each other, and even though they'll have the player for less, the importance on getting that player then is much more of a priority than it was before they knew who they were. So you can't predict any of these things. I'm not saying the Sixers are going to hold Ben Simmons out until the trade deadline because the market's going to go up. But the concept and the argument that is made a lot on these is that if the Sixers had handled it in a better way, if they'd been nicer about it, that the value would be higher across the league. I just don't buy that. And I don't think it's this decreasing asset every single day here. It's just a complicated deal because Philly doesn't want to just give this dude away. So let's look at some of the potential stuff. Even the Golden State thing that isn't going to happen, at least that price. And I think there's some confusion or some disagreement out there on how bad they even wanted him. Again, I've always said this, if I'm Golden State, why am I fixing your problem at an exorbitant price? If you're Philly and you were going to get Wiseman, it's just like, as much as I'd like the idea of what Wiseman could be, I'm still not going to be shocked either if he's on a second team in year 4 or 5 and we're reading the misunderstood Wiseman piece. I still can't. I wish I could invest in the misunderstood Mo Bamba piece that's going to happen in the next year or so and call that, but there's no market to be able to invest in those kinds of things. The Minnesota stuff, you've been over it, right? All right, no Towns, no Edwards, I get it. But when you're writing and potentially, they don't really want to move D'Angelo Russell, I don't understand why Philly would even want D'Angelo Russell. He is best on a team that isn't very good and you can take 1,000,000 shots and put up numbers. The Golden State stuff, as we went over, like, all right, cool, a bunch of young guys and a backup center that you can never play with Embiid. Like, they're trying to come out of the East now. I think the San Antonio thing is a possible fit, but I don't know what the pieces are coming back from San Antonio that gets Philadelphia really excited. Sacramento, we've been over that, right? Okay, you're not getting De'Aaron Fox. He's kind of your marquee guy, but I can't have one of the other point guards. I gotta pretend I'm excited about Bagley, and Hield's a nice player, but does he solve a bunch of problems? And I think Harrison Barnes is always somebody who's going to put up some numbers, but I don't know that you're ever really counting on. What you're trying to figure out is how big is the gap from Embiid to the next guy? And that's why, even though, look, the Celtics are interested, I don't think Terrell's going to do that with the Celtics. The John Wall rumor that I've seen the past week that I couldn't stop making fun of, I just don't understand why anybody would want an unhealthy John Wall for $91 million. I mean, I get they're both rep by clutch, but that's one of those rumors where you got to kind of check yourself a little bit. But again, impossible things do happen in this league. I just don't think Daryl would be signing up for $91 million in John Wall. I keep getting back to the Portland deal. CJ McCollum, I feel like that deal has been there and it's been available to Philadelphia for a long time. And if you're a Sixers fan, maybe you're like, wait a minute, does that make us better? It may not be like how big is the gap between what Simmons is worth and what CJ McCollum is worth? I mean, CJ just turned 30 3 days ago. even though he missed a bunch of games in another weird season this past season, he's been pretty healthy, actually, if you run through the previous 5 or 6. He's 40% from three for his career. The assist numbers are up to career high levels. Some of the metrics are good. The shooting metrics are really good. Some of the other numbers have gotten better. Some of the box score plus minus stuff isn't as good. Defensively, you'd have to worry about Seth Curry and CJ at that time. But if you've watched CJ, and most of us, you guys listen to this podcast, most of us have watched him, like you go, okay, he's not a 1 on a great team. There's 2s that are better on really good teams. But the shooting, the ball handling, the playmaking off of Embiid that's giving you something you've never had in Simmons, I don't think it's a terrible deal. And maybe that's what this ends up coming down to, is that, all right, this makes the most sense. It's the best of all the assets. Now, I'll never pretend that I know all the stuff that's being talked about, because I don't. Not on something like this. So whenever I think about all these different pieces, I go, what have I heard? What have I even heard that's rumored that it actually is better and a better fit than CJ McCollum at this point? It's not a million young pieces. It's not a bunch of unknowns. It's not John Wall at $91 million. There's one final thought on this. All right. What does this mean for the future of the league? Because we know, as we've talked about this, the NBA owners, they didn't like the 7-year deal, so they made him 6. They didn't like the 6, so they made him 5. They didn't like 5. 5 was only for certain people. It's really 4. So we had shorter deals, guys moving on. Then we had guys doing even shorter deals of player options where it was a 4-year deal, but it was actually kind of fake because it was 3 or 3-year deals of the player option. So it was only 2. LeBron was doing this year-to-year stuff constantly. But now players aren't doing year-to-year for the flexibility. They're just maxing out whatever their extension is, being like, all right, I'll take the money, and then I'll let you know if I want to bounce. The public has accepted. We have accepted that if you have a year left and you're upset, you can ask your way out. We don't get as mad as we would have 10 years ago. We just have. That is the progression of being exposed to things more and more. It's kind of like patches on a jersey where you're like, oh my God, that's going to be the worst. You don't even think about them now. It's not exactly the same thing, but what I'm telling you is we become desensitized to things that we think we won't be, just the more we're exposed to them. And in this case, we've become desensitized for even being critical for a guy saying, hey, I want out. But with 4 years left and wanting out, that's something completely different. And the reason I bring this up in the final thought is because this will have a long-term, if this is the norm where you just max out with the team you don't even want to be with to get the extra year and to get the extra raises, and then it becomes commonplace to then ask out like Simmons is with 4 years left. And he can bitch about how he was treated, all that different stuff, whatever. You're culpable in this as well. But if the norm is, I don't even care about free agency anymore. Just give me the max dollars. Now I can just try to just move on whenever I want. Then cap space, building your team with a goal of having cap space in a couple of years becomes even more worthless than it has been. Cap space has always been an overrated strategy. All right. Because you don't know. And for the 7 or 8 teams that have cap space that are planning on this guy and that guy, half those guys get re-signed, and now they're almost all re-signing. And then you're left there with cap space, and you're trying to figure out if Jabari Parker wants to do a 1-year deal for $20 million just so you can get to the salary floor and then clear the decks the next year. If guys keep signing long-term deals and maxing out as long as they're allowed to, and then think, hey, it's normal now that I can ask out with 3 or 4 years left, and we're not there yet, then any team or front office that's telling you, hey, we're designing this to have a ton of cap space in 2024 because a bunch of guys are going to be coming up. Look, Danny Ainge, when he liked me, told me this years ago. He's like, you guys in the media are obsessed with building for cap space. He goes, I like trades because I know who I'm getting. And most everybody is left with a bag of money during that offseason going, we didn't get any of the guys we wanted, because there's really only 2 or 3, if you're lucky, that are changing your franchise that much. It's usually that number's even lower. So you're planning for the unknown. And then when you don't execute the plan, your entire fan base is sitting there being like, hey, you kept telling me for 2 years you were doing all these deals to build the cap space, and now it doesn't even matter. That was back then. I can't even imagine how bad that strategy would be now.